Hello, everybody. My name is Brooke Joseph, and I'm an 18-year-old innovator and a huge math nerd. I love math, and I have been obsessed with artificial intelligence all year. And because of my obsession, I have actually, with both subjects, I've actually taken on the liberty and task to create a paper that kind of dives deep into the math behind neural networks. So in this specific investigation, I was using kind of like a CNN that I kind of made up to kind of mimic how a CNN would work for like the MNIST dataset, which is, if you're unfamiliar with, a bunch of numbers that are drawn in a 28 by 28 pixel grid, except for this one, there was absolutely no way I was doing calculations for 28 by 28 pixels. So I did a 2 by 2 grid, which was 4 pixels, which was much easier to tend to. And then I created a neural network based off of that. So, if you are unfamiliar with neural networks, I highly suggest checking out the paper and reading the paper, because this is going to be a very condensed overview and understanding and debrief of the paper, because there's so much detail in it and I'm actually really proud of it, and I kind of want to explain each step. But I probably will not be going into the fundamentals and the introduction of NNs, so please feel free to check them out, because I do provide somewhat of an in-depth explanation of how they work using an example of a die and going through that. Like I said, the whole investigation was kind of how we can design and create neural networks that are efficiently able to detect different numbers from drawings. And so I'm very proud of the final product of this paper. It took a very long time. I actually started it like a year ago. In a month, it will be a year. It'll be a year anniversary from the start of this. So what I used for this investigation, I really wanted to include this into the paper, not only because it's kind of like a general format of the paper, but also because if you are very interested in doing something similar, I feel like it'd be good to have somewhat of an idea of how to get started. So the idea, or kind of what I did here, was I reached out to a bunch of professionals on LinkedIn who know what they're talking about, know their stuff, because at the time, and still even now, I am no expert in this. And there's so much more and so much more math involved in this, and then what I covered. This is just the basics, but I reached out to a lot of people to kind of understand what I was doing and also feel confident in the final product and know that I'm producing stuff that is legit, that is real, that is good. So I did reach out to a lot of people who are very familiar with this and have been investigating it for a while. And I also reached out to my math teacher, and he is a IB math teacher, not a chemistry teacher, and he taught me HL math, which was a very intense course, by the way, and he helped me majorly along the way. I owe him a lot of credit for the help in this process. And I also reached out to professors at my local university, which is the University of Windsor, and I spoke with them and I got some advice. They were very kind, and they donated both their time and resources to kind of help with this. One professor sent me a really cool paper on the use of gradient descent in neural networks, which actually helped a lot. And then going on top of that, I also went to my local university, got some textbooks, and was cross-referencing between research papers and making it make sense because a lot of the times I was doing it very much independently. A lot of this stuff was by myself, and then just confirmation from people to make sure that it was legit. And this was back when ChatGPT was like barely a thing, and so like no one knew about it. So I did not use ChatGPT, and even to this day I rarely use it. But I just figured out a lot of it through the textbooks, like back in my day when ChatGPT didn't exist. So yeah, that's kind of how I did it. So if you're interested in doing something similar, there you go. There's the process. If you want to do it, it's a lot of work, but it's definitely rewarding. Basic variables, terms that I use in the paper are outlined, and I have that all there for you to kind of scroll through and understand. But the basic things that you need to know are weights, biases, and then the actual loss functions. So the loss function measures kind of the difference between the actual value that the network was supposed to yield versus the predicted value by the network. That's essentially what it does, and it uses a statistical framework called mean squared error to kind of calculate this, and then we're taking the sum of each of the outputs there. And that's kind of what the loss function is. Not complicated, very simple. The variables W and B. W represents the weights, And if you are unfamiliar with the architecture of a neural network, again, highly suggest checking out my paper because I do explain it in the first little bit of the paper. But just a quick little debrief, it essentially connects one node from a layer to a node from another layer and provides a sort of emphasis on the data, the value. So that's kind of the idea behind weights there. And then biases are a number that are adjusted by programmers to kind of sway the data in a certain way. Okay, so then we also have the sigmoid function. The sigmoid function is actually kind of used to squish the values that are, so that the values in the network don't get too large, and that the network can also kind of just play around and understand things. And so that's kind of the idea of the sigmoid function. There's also the ReLU function that is actually more commonly used nowadays, and that's a different function that's also you can use. But I'm a fan of the sigmoid function because it's a cooler looking function than the ReLU in my opinion. So I also should mention that in a node, there are two sides. Each side have different calculations going on. In the first side, we have the simple, actually I would say it's probably the more complicated side. And then the other side is just squishing the values, squishing what we took from this side, squishing into the sigmoid value. So the out value is actually going to be the value that is taken in from the previous nodes. You take that value and then you get the value. So basically what you do is you take the values from each of the previous nodes and then you take the weights, you multiply them, and then whatever that value is, we define that as the out value, and then the net value is what we get after running it through the sigmoid or ReLU function. In this specific example, it's going to be the sigmoid function, and then that's what goes on to the next layer. And then after we multiply it by each of the weights there, then we get a new out value, and then that's what that. So the notation is going to change, but overall, those are what those values represent. The K value is also going to represent the final layer of and then as demonstrated in the variable description of my paper, if we have a superscript, the upper one with a K, that just represents that out value is in the last layer. So the superscript just essentially represents what layer the value is in. Okay, so that is all the values. Now in the paper, I actually start from first principles explaining all the math. So I start with what matrices are, and then I also go into partial derivatives, which are crazy and cool, but I will leave that to the paper because I'm also really proud of kind of the explanation I gave in the paper. I explained partial derivatives from a very theoretical standpoint, not just how you do them, like not just like the paper, like you go on paper and you take the derivative, whatever. No, I explained what it represents. And so I highly suggest looking at that. I also have some visuals from something called GeoGebra, and I suggest checking out those visuals. It's kind of cool. Okay, so now to the good part. Okay, so now the backpropagation is the difficult part, like the very difficult part. It actually requires a bunch of partial derivatives and using something called the chain rule in partial derivatives. And in general, if you are familiar with calculus, you will know what the chain rule is. And that's basically what we're doing. We're starting at what we want on the bottom and what we want on the top. And then in general, what we want to do is we actually want to take the partial derivative of the loss function with respect to each of the weight values, and then, or each of the different weights. And then what we do is we calculate that specific partial, and then that is going to be useful for determining the new updated weight value. So I do not have this memorized by heart, so I'm just going to read it off the paper, just because it is quite complicated. But in general, the computations for the partial derivative of the loss function with respect to any weight value is going to be this. The partial of the loss with respect to the partial of the actual value, partial of the actual value with respect to the partial of the net value in the last layer, partial of the net value vector with respect to the partial of the out value of the layer next to the last layer, and then the partial of the second last layer with respect to the net of the second last layer, and then partial of the net of the second last layer, partial of the third last layer out. You see where it's mind-boggling? It's crazy. And then you go ... until the desired layer that you want. Okay, so it's a little crazy, a little bit of a lot there. a lot going on. And so what we can do is we can actually generalize this, or sorry, not generalize this, we can actually use this to kind of calculate specific weight values. So this is where, you know, like the complicated part of the whole process. And so if you can really wrap your head around those partials and make it make sense, it's very simple from there. And actually, it's interesting because if you take the time to understand just partial derivatives and you take the time to understand the chain rule, this will be so easy. Like the chain rule, it all makes sense because what we're doing is we want something on the bottom, we want something on the top, and then everything in the middle needs to cancel out. So it's kind of like a puzzle at that point. How do we make it cancel out? How do we make this work? Okay, so now for the gradient descent part, what we want to do is we want to pick a learning rate. So the learning rate is essentially going to represent how fast we want the values to converge to a local minimum, because again, what we want to do is we want to minimize the loss function. That's the whole idea of this paper, right? Or the whole idea of training a network here. And so the new weight value is going to represent is going to be equal to the old weight value minus the learning rate times the partial derivative of the loss function with respect to the partial derivative of the specific weight value you're looking for. And so that's how you calculate that. Kind of fun, kind of cool. And then I actually go through the calculations there. But I think the coolest part of this paper is actually finding the generalization, because I feel like I've looked all over online to find that, and I have yet to find that. So I was really excited to kind of to find that there. That was really cool. But yes, overall, this is the whole paper. If you have any questions at all, I'm more than happy to try my best to answer them. Leave them in the comments or message me on LinkedIn, whatever. I'm very passionate about this area. And if you have any critiques with the paper or any kind of points of confusion, or you don't necessarily agree with a specific point, I'm more than happy to kind of have that conversation. So thank you so much for your time in watching this video, and I hope that you enjoyed the paper as much as I did writing it.